The labor auction in Dry Creek, New Mexico territory was held on the courthouse steps every third Saturday, and most Saturdays it sold exactly what it sounded like it sold: drifters and drunks too poor to pay their own fines, auctioned off for 30 or 60 days of labor to whoever bid highest on their debt. On the second Saturday of April 1883, the item on the block was a man nobody in town could put a name to. He had been found 3 days before, a mile off the stage road, beaten close to death and robbed of everything but his boots, and Doc Anselm had spent 2 nights and most of his own medicine keeping him breathing. The town had no jail budget for a stranger, with no crime and no money. And the judge, a practical and not especially kind man named Otis Frame, had ruled that an unclaimed debt for 2 nights of doctoring and a week of jail board was a debt like any other, and put the man up for auction to whoever would pay it off in exchange for his labor once he was well enough to give any. Silas Grout bid first, a rancher known through 3 counties for working hired men into the ground and paying them in excuses. He opened at $8, the kind of number meant to signal he expected no competition, because decent people did not bid against Silas Grout for a man they'd have to nurse back to health themselves first. Cora Nash had not walked to town that morning intending to buy a person. She had walked to town to sell 6 colts and buy fence wire, and she stood at the back of the small crowd with her fence money folded in her coat pocket and watched Silas Grout's face while he looked over the barely conscious stranger on the platform, the way he looked over cattle at auction, and something in her went hard and quick before her better judgment had a chance to weigh in. $12, she said. The crowd turned. Grout turned slower and uglier. That's my grocery money for a month, Miss Nash, thrown at a man who might not live the week. Then you've lost nothing you can't earn back, and I've lost a man I never had, Cora said. Judge, is the bid good? Judge Frame, who had exactly no patience left for Silas Grout after 20 years on that bench, banged his gavel with something close to relief. Sold to Miss Cora Nash, $12, 60 days' labor owed against her account. I have looked into a fair number of these old territorial vagrancy auctions, and I will tell you plainly that most of them ended exactly as ugly as they sound. A desperate man worked half to death by whoever paid least for him. This one did not, and the reason it did not is standing right there on the courthouse steps, arguing down a bully for $12 over a stranger she had never once heard speak a full sentence. She had no idea, hauling him home in the bed of her wagon that afternoon, that she had just bought 60 days' labor from a man who could have paid off the entire county's debts twice over, if only he had still possessed a single piece of paper proving who he actually was. He did not wake for 2 full days, and when he finally did, on the 3rd morning, in the narrow spare room off Cora's kitchen, the first thing he said was not his name. It was a question, asked in a voice too clear and too carefully spoken for a man who'd been found half dead in a ditch. "Where is my father's letter?" "You didn't have any letter on you," Cora said, setting down a bowl of broth. "You didn't have anything on you at all, mister, but the boots on your feet and enough bruises to paper a barn. What do I call you?" He was quiet a long moment, and something moved behind his eyes that Cora, without being able to name it, recognized as a man deciding how much of the truth was safe to spend. "Tom," he said finally. "Call me Tom." It did not sit right with her, not from the first hour, though she could not have told you exactly why. Tom's hands, once they healed, were not a drifter's hands. He mended her fence line, correcting the tension on the wire with a precision no self-taught rancher bothered with, and once, delirious with fever in his 2nd week, he had recited a full page of Latin under his breath, clear and unhurried, like a man reading it off a page only he could see. He ate with manners nobody taught in a bunkhouse. He flinched, once, hard, when Cora mentioned in passing that a letter had come to the general store from a Chicago law office looking for information about a missing rancher's son, and then covered the flinch so fast she nearly convinced herself she'd imagined it. "You're no drifter," she said to him plainly, 6 weeks into his 60 days, sitting on the porch step shelling peas while he mended a bridle beside her. "I don't need your whole history, Tom, or whatever your name actually is. I bought 60 days of honest work, and that's what I've gotten. More than fair. But I'd be lying if I said I hadn't noticed you're hiding something considerably larger than a name." Tom set the bridle down and looked at her for a long moment, the way a man looks at a door he has been afraid to open for a very long time. "If I told you," he said slowly, "you'd be in more danger than you are now, simply for knowing it. I have spent 2 months being grateful you don't ask harder questions, Cora Nash, and I don't know how to thank a woman for that kind of mercy, except by not spending it foolishly." "That's not an answer," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't. It's the only honest thing I can give you yet." The truth came out sideways, the way most true things eventually do, when Cora's own boot heel gave out and she borrowed Tom's spare pair to ride to town, and a hidden seam in the left heel split wide on the ride, spilling a small object into the dirt of her own yard. It was a signet ring, heavy gold, engraved with a crest she did not recognize, a rearing horse beneath a banner of wheat, and worked into the band in letters so small she had to hold it to the window light to read them at all. N.A.B. She was standing in the yard, turning it over in her hand, when Tom came around the barn and saw what she was holding. And for the first time in 2 months, Cora Nash watched every careful wall the man had built around himself come down at once, not from anger, but from something closer to exhaustion. "Nathaniel Alden Bellamy," he said quietly, before she could even ask. "That's my name, Cora. My father is, or was, Charles Bellamy, of Bellamy Cattle and Rail, out of Chicago. I expect you've heard of the company even out here. Half the beef that leaves this territory ships out under our contracts." Cora had heard of it. Everyone who sold cattle within 400 miles had heard of Bellamy Cattle and Rail, a name spoken with the particular respect reserved for money too large to argue with. "My father died 8 months ago," Nathaniel went on, sitting down heavily on the porch step, as if the name itself weighed something. "Before he died, he'd begun to suspect his own business partner, a man named Julian Ashgrove, of skimming profits off the Western cattle contracts, moving cattle on paper that never existed on the ground, pocketing the difference. I came out here myself, quietly, under no name at all, to look at the actual herds against the actual ledgers, because I no longer trusted anyone back in Chicago to look honestly, my father's own lawyers included." "And somebody found out you were looking," Cora said slowly. "Somebody found out considerably faster than I expected, which tells me Ashgrove has eyes in places I hadn't accounted for. 3 men jumped me on the stage road, took every paper I carried, my father's signet ring off my hand, which I'd hidden the twin of in that boot heel, out of exactly this fear, and left me for dead in a ditch, which by every account they had every reason to believe I was." He looked at the ring in her palm. "If Julian Ashgrove believes I'm dead, Cora, he has already begun the process of having me declared so in law, which would hand him controlling interest in a company worth more money than this whole territory sees in a year. If word reaches Chicago that I'm alive, he will not make the same mistake of an incomplete job twice." Cora sat down on the step beside him, the ring cooling in her palm, and asked the only question that seemed to matter. "Why not just tell me sooner? I bought you off an auction block for $12 and nursed you back from a fever, Tom, or Nathaniel, or whatever I'm meant to call you now. I think I'd earned the truth before your boot heel earned it for you. Because the moment you knew, he said, you became a target too, if Ashgrove's men ever traced me here, and I have watched what that man is willing to do to protect a fortune he didn't earn. I would rather you be angry with me for withholding it than dead for knowing it a week sooner. He turned the full weight of his attention on her, and something in his voice cracked open in a way it never had in 2 months of careful politeness. I have more money sitting in banks I may never safely touch again than this entire valley is worth, and not $1 of it has done me a single bit of good since the day those men left me in that ditch. You bought a broken man for $12 and gave him back his life without once asking what he was worth. I have never, in my whole privileged existence, been handled with that kind of honesty, and I find I am considerably more afraid of losing it than I ever was of losing the company. I want to pause here and note something the county records confirm plainly enough, because it matters to how the rest of this story unfolds. Nathaniel Bellamy could have ridden east that same week, wired his family's lawyers, and settled the entire business from the safety of a hotel room with armed guards at the door. He did not. He stayed on Cora Nash's ranch, finished the remaining weeks of labor he had been auctioned for as if the debt still bound him, and told her plainly that he intended to keep his word to a judge and a bill of sale before he spent one moment settling scores with a man who had tried to have him killed. That's either the most honorable thing I've ever heard, Cora said, or the most foolish. With Julian Ashgrove hunting the same roads I'm standing on, Nathaniel said. I expect it's both, Nathaniel asked her, once, in the quiet middle stretch of that summer, why a woman with her own small ranch to run and her own bills to worry over had bid $12 on a stranger nobody else in Dry Creek thought worth the trouble. Cora did not answer right away. She had never told the whole of it to anyone in town, not because it was shameful, but because grief, that specific, tends to sound like an excuse if you say it out loud too often. My father worked 20 years for the Anderson spread 2 valleys over, she said finally. Broke horses for them, built half their fence line with his own hands, and when a fall broke his hip at 51 and he couldn't ride the way he used to, Anderson auctioned off his labor contract, same as they'd auction off a lamed horse, to cover what he called an outstanding feed bill that appeared out of nowhere the same week my father stopped being useful to him. Bought by a man 3 counties over, who worked him at half wages, doing what he still could until the day he died, and not one person in that whole valley called it anything but business. I'm sorry, Nathaniel said quietly. I'm not telling you for sympathy. I'm telling you because I watched an entire county decide a man's worth by how much work was left in his body, and I swore to myself, standing at his grave at 19 years old with $11 to my name, that if I ever stood in a position to bid on somebody the way that county bid on my father, I'd bid like a person instead of a buyer. She looked at him steadily. $12 wasn't charity, Tom. It was the one time in my life I've had the money and the standing to answer a wrong I watched happen to somebody I loved. 20 years too late to matter to him, but not too late to matter to somebody. It explained a great deal Nathaniel had wondered about, and never quite asked outright. Why a woman running a modest horse operation alone had looked at a half-dead stranger and seen a person worth defending rather than a debt worth avoiding. It also explained, though neither of them said so directly that afternoon, why the growing feeling between them had taken root in something sturdier than gratitude on his side, or curiosity on hers. They had both, in their own ways, spent years learning exactly what it cost to be valued only for what use you could still provide, and had found, in each other, the considerably rarer experience of being valued for something else entirely. Silas Grout, predictably, did not let the matter of his lost $12 auction rest quietly, and his particular grievance found its outlet 3 weeks later in a visit to Cora's ranch that he dressed up as neighborly business, and everyone present recognized as something considerably pettier. "Word in town is your hired man's healed up fine," Grout said, not dismounting, looking at Nathaniel mending fence with the same assessing eye he'd used on the auction block. 60 days must be about up. I'll take his contract off your hands if you've had your fill of nursing strangers, Miss Nash. Full value, no argument, save you the trouble of feeding a grown man through another winter. He's not a debt to be traded, Mr. Grout, Cora said. And his 60 days concluded 2 weeks past. He stays on now because I asked him to, and he agreed, which is a considerably different arrangement than the one you're describing. Grout's eyes moved to Nathaniel, and something in his expression suggested he had noticed, the way small-minded men often noticed exactly the wrong details, that the hired man in question carried himself with a great deal more confidence than 60 days on a modest horse ranch generally produced. "Awful particular manners for a drifter," Grout said. "Almost like you weren't raised the way you're presently living." It was, Nathaniel realized later, the closest anyone in Dry Creek had come all summer to guessing at the truth, and it was guessed at out of nothing more than petty resentment rather than any real suspicion, which was its own kind of lucky. He answered Grout with nothing more than a level, unbothered stare, the particular stillness of a man who had learned, over 2 months, that silence answered bullies considerably better than argument ever had. Grout rode off unsatisfied and unconvinced of anything beyond his own wounded pride, and Cora, watching him go, allowed herself a small, tired laugh. "That man has spent 20 years mistaking cruelty for shrewdness," she said. "One day it's going to cost him considerably more than $12. She did not know yet how soon, or how completely, that day was coming, nor that the fortune quietly waiting behind her hired man's careful manners would eventually settle Silas Grout's debts as easily and as thoroughly as it would settle everything else that summer had left unresolved. The stranger who rode into Dry Creek 3 weeks later called himself a cattle buyer and told a reasonably convincing story about scouting herds for an Eastern contract, and Cora Nash disliked him within 30 seconds of watching him ask entirely too many careful questions at the general store about a man found beaten on the stage road back in April. His name, when the storekeeper finally produced it for the ledger, was Wendell Doss, and Nathaniel, told the name that evening, went the color of old ash. "Ashgrove's man," he said, "his fixer. If Doss is asking questions in this town, Ashgrove suspects I'm alive, and he has sent the one man capable of finishing what those 3 failed to do properly the first time." "Then we go to the sheriff," Cora said. "With what proof? A ring and a story?" Ashgrove has spent 8 months and considerable money making certain the only proof that ever existed either burned in a fire at my father's offices or disappeared, along with 3 hired men who have not been seen since the night they left me in that ditch. Doss did not survive this long in Ashgrove's employ by leaving paper trails behind him. It was Doc Anselm, of all people, who handed them the paper trail Ashgrove had failed to erase completely. Treating Wendell Doss for a minor injury 2 days later, discretion being a doctor's oldest habit, Anselm noticed a leather satchel the man would not let out of arm's reach even while his wound was dressed, and noticed, on the strap, a return address tag from a Chicago law office, the very same firm Nathaniel had told Cora he no longer trusted. A man doesn't carry his employer's own law firm's correspondence case into a cattle-buying trip, Anselm told them both that night, in his surgery with the shades drawn. Whatever's in that satchel, it isn't cattle contracts. What was in that satchel, Nathaniel and Cora would not learn the contents of directly for 2 more tense days. But knowing it existed, and where Doss kept it, was the first genuine advantage either of them had held since a signet ring split out of a boot heel and changed the whole shape of the year. Getting a look inside Wendell Doss's satchel meant getting Wendell Doss away from it, and it was Cora, not Nathaniel, who worked out how. Doss had been in town a week, and a man scouting cattle for an eastern contract, who never once rode out to actually look at any cattle was, Cora pointed out, either the laziest buyer in territorial history or a man with no genuine interest in buying anything at all. She rode out to the hotel herself on the pretext of offering her own herd for his inspection, a reasonable errand for any rancher, and kept him occupied a full 2 hours riding her fence lines and talking prices he had no intention of ever paying. It was time enough for Doc Anselm, who had cultivated over 30 years of practice, a talent for looking entirely unremarkable while doing something he had no business doing, to let himself into Doss's hotel room with a key the hotel keeper owed him a favor for, and open the satchel long enough to copy, in his own careful hand, the 3 documents that mattered most. The first was a letter from Julian Ashgrove to the Chicago law firm, dated 2 weeks after Nathaniel's disappearance, instructing them to begin the quiet legal process of declaring Nathaniel Bellamy dead in absentia, citing the attack and a fabricated eyewitness account of a body recovered and buried unidentified, a body that, as far as anyone in Dry Creek knew, had never existed at all. The second was a ledger page in Ashgrove's own hand, tracking cattle contracts that existed only on paper, shipments invoiced and paid for that no herd anywhere in the territory had ever actually produced, the exact scheme Charles Bellamy had died suspecting and never lived to prove. The third was the one that mattered most in a courtroom, a payment record disguised as a consulting fee made out to Wendell Doss himself, dated the same week as the attack on the stage road, for services described only as territorial security, a phrase Doc Anselm found grimly, darkly funny given the circumstances. "This is enough to hang the scheme," Nathaniel said that night, reading the copied pages by lamplight with hands that were not entirely steady. "It is not enough to hang Ashgrove for the attack itself, unless Doss himself testifies to it, and Doss has no earthly reason to testify against the man paying him. Then we give him one," Cora said. Between the bluff Judge Frame sent east and Wendell Doss's confession the following morning, there passed one night that Cora would later describe as the longest of that entire summer, longer even than the 3 days Nathaniel had spent unconscious in her spare room back in April. They did not know, sending that telegram, whether Doss would fold or run, and a man who ran with Ashgrove's money behind him could disappear into any of a dozen mining camps or border towns and never be found again, taking with him the one piece of testimony that turned a stack of copied documents into an actual case against the man who had ordered Nathaniel left for dead. Nathaniel spent that night on Cora's porch rather than in his bed, watching the road, a rifle across his knees for the first time since she had known him, and when she came out near midnight and sat down beside him without a word, he did not send her back inside. "If this goes wrong," he said quietly, watching the dark road, "if Doss runs instead of folds, Ashgrove will know within the week that I'm alive and that I have proof. He'll stop sending men who fail. He'll come himself, or send someone considerably more careful than Wendell Doss. Then we'll be considerably more careful too," Cora said. "You are not facing that man alone in a ditch a second time, Nathaniel Bellamy. Whatever comes up that road, it finds the both of us waiting for it." He looked at her for a long moment in the dark, and whatever he had meant to say about danger and fortune and the wisdom of keeping her clear of both of it seemed to leave him all at once, replaced by something considerably simpler. $12, he said, almost to himself, shaking his head slightly. "I have advisors in Chicago, paid $10,000 a year, who have never once sat up a whole night on a porch, prepared to mean it." "Advisors paid $10,000 a year generally haven't got as much to lose," Cora said, and did not move from the step beside him until the sky went gray and no riders had come, and the wire from Chicago, when it finally arrived 2 mornings later, found them both still standing, considerably more tired and considerably more certain of one another than either had been the week before. The reason arrived in the form of a telegram from the Territorial Marshal's office, sent at Judge Frame's own request, once he'd been shown, in careful confidence, exactly what Doc Anselm's copied documents contained. It informed Wendell Doss, care of the Dry Creek Hotel, that a federal inquiry into fraudulent cattle contracts filed against Bellamy Cattle and Rail had already begun in Chicago, weeks before Doss had ever ridden west, and that any man found to have accepted payment connected to those contracts would be treated, going forward, either as a witness or as a conspirator, and that the difference between those two futures would be decided entirely by how quickly and how honestly he chose to speak. It was, Judge Frame admitted afterward with some satisfaction, almost entirely a bluff. The federal inquiry existed. Its timeline did not, quite, match what the telegram implied. But Wendell Doss had spent his whole disreputable career reading exactly this kind of pressure correctly, and he read this one exactly as Cora had hoped he would, as the sound of a door closing on Julian Ashgrove considerably faster than anyone in Chicago had accounted for. He came to Judge Frame's chambers the following morning, not out of any late-blooming conscience, but out of the oldest motive in any courtroom, self-preservation, and told the whole of it plainly. Ashgrove had ordered the attack on the stage road, paid 3 men to make certain of it, and paid Doss to come finish the job properly once word reached Chicago, through a careless slip of Doc Anselm's own earlier telegram inquiring after unclaimed patients, that the intended victim had somehow survived. "He told me straight out the boy was worth more to him dead than alive," Doss said, and had the decency, at least, to look uncomfortable saying it in front of the boy himself, very much alive, sitting 3 feet away. "I've done a great many things I'm not proud of, Judge. I draw a line somewhere. Finishing a job on a man already broken half to death in a ditch was further past that line than even I go." Judge Frame took his sworn statement, wired the whole of it east, along with copies of Doc Anselm's documents, and within the month, a very different kind of telegram arrived in Dry Creek. This one addressed directly to Nathaniel Alden Bellamy, confirming that Julian Ashgrove had been arrested in Chicago on charges of fraud and conspiracy to commit murder, and that the whole of Bellamy Cattle and Rail, along with a fortune Nathaniel had very nearly stopped believing he would ever safely claim, was once again, unambiguously, his. Here is the part of this story that the Chicago newspapers, when they eventually got hold of it, found considerably harder to explain than the fraud and the attempted murder combined. Nathaniel Bellamy went east exactly once, for exactly 6 weeks, long enough to testify at Ashgrove's trial, install lawyers he actually trusted to run the company's daily business, and settle his father's estate. Every single person who dealt with him during those 6 weeks reported the same peculiar detail back to Dry Creek eventually, that the heir, to one of the largest fortunes in the territory, kept asking, in every meeting, how quickly he could conclude his business and get back west. He came back in June, on the same stage road where 3 men had once left him for dead, and he came back not to a hotel or a townhouse, but to Cora Nash's ranch, where 60 days of labor had technically concluded months before, and where, by any honest accounting, he had never actually stopped working since. "I could buy you any ranch in this territory," he told her, standing in her yard with his hat in his hands, the way a considerably poorer man might have stood there. Any ranch, any house, any life you wanted, and I find I don't want to offer you any of it, because the only $12 anyone has ever spent on me that meant a single thing was the $12 you spent when you had no earthly reason to believe I was worth it. You're worth considerably more than $12 now, Cora said, not quite steady. I was worth exactly as much then as I am now, Nathaniel said. You just happened to be the only person in this whole territory who bid on the man instead of the fortune. They married that autumn, in a ceremony so plain that half the Chicago papers, when they eventually ran the story under a headline about the vanished heir found alive, could not quite believe the photographs were real. A rancher's daughter in her one good dress, standing beside a man worth more money than the whole territory, married in a yard with borrowed chairs and a fiddle player paid in fresh bread. Nathaniel used a portion of the fortune, quietly and without announcement, to buy out Silas Grout's note at the bank and forgive it, a piece of mercy Grout never once thanked him for, and never once forgot either. The rest of it he mostly left in Chicago, running the company from a distance through lawyers he trusted, and spent the better part of every year exactly where he'd first learned what an honest $12 was worth. If this story found you, there is another one waiting, complete from first hoofbeat to last, right here on the Cowgirl Chronicles. Come sit with me again soon. Sometimes, the best spent money in the world is the money nobody expects to see again.